good afternoon to you, or good morning, good evening, depending where you are. I'm in Brighton in the UK, so it's the afternoon here and it's quite sunny. And today I'm going to be talking about developing learner autonomy in digital learning contexts. And I recommend having a pen and paper handy, as you'll need it for one of the activities today. So grab a pen and paper quickly if you haven't got one already. So I'd like to start by finding out a bit about you and your teaching contexts. So you should see a poll on your screen now. So what is your teaching context? Are you teaching in face-to-face classes in the classroom? Are you teaching in online classes? Or are you teaching in hybrid classes with some students in the room and some students online? So if you enter your answer into the poll now, you can select more than one option if you're teaching in more than one context. And my teaching contexts are quite varied. I do some face-to-face classes, but most of my teaching is online at the moment. And when the pandemic necessitates, I also teach hybrid classes. So I'll give you just a moment to vote. Remember, you can select more than one. So what are your teaching contexts? Okay, let's have a look at the results of the poll. Okay, so we've got lots of people, 46% teaching in face-to-face classes, good chunk of people teaching in online classes and hybrid classes as well. Great, okay. So you're in the right place. Hopefully you'll gain some useful insights and some interesting ideas today that you can use in your teaching. So why have we decided to do this session? Well, let's think about teaching and learning and how they've changed in the past 2 years. So what are your experiences? What are your observations? How have teaching and learning changed in the past 2 years? Type your answers into the chat box. How have teaching and learning changed in the past 2 years? Okay, so we've got more blended learning, more asynchronous learning for learners, more self-directed. Lots of answers coming in here. Technology use. So people are talking about self-directed learning, self-learning, very digitalized, yes. Lots more technology, more possibilities, the combination of online and tech-based learning. And some people are saying that they've started teaching online due to the pandemic. So I know this has been quite new for a lot of teachers in the last couple of years. Okay, answers coming in thick and fast now. Thank you for your contributions. I'll just give you a moment to read this slide. So as we're all aware, and as some of you have mentioned, teaching and learning have changed a lot in the past few years. And around the world, both students and teachers have needed to engage in distanced and in digital learning. And in order for students to learn effectively in remote contexts, learner autonomy is becoming increasingly valuable and necessary. So this is why we're bringing you this presentation today, and this is what we're going to be doing. So we're going to explore the concept of learner autonomy and what it involves in digital learning contexts. We're going to consider how learner autonomy can benefit both learners and teachers. And we're going to introduce a range of practical approaches to developing learner autonomy in digital contexts. So you should have some practical ideas that you can take away at the end of today's session and use in your own classrooms, whether they are face-to-face, online, or hybrid. So let's start with learner autonomy. What is learner autonomy? And I have a question for you here. What do you already know? What do you understand by the term learner autonomy? Type your ideas, type your answers into the chat box. I'll give you a moment just to do that. What do you understand by the term learner autonomy. Okay, so Nada is saying learning independently. Anna's saying self-study, managing time, self-assessment, self-directed learning, the ability to study independently, to learn on your own. Learner choice here is quite interesting, taking responsibility for your own learning. Some great answers coming in here. Showing initiative as a student, self-motivating, upskilling when needed. That's interesting, I like that answer. So we've got lots of people saying self-study, so learning independently, creating one's own skills. So there's a lot about responsibility here. Okay. Learner autonomy is the ability to take charge of one's own learning. So you're absolutely right. And this is sometimes referred to as self-regulated learning. Self-regulation is the ability to understand and to manage one's own behaviors. In this case, we're talking about learning behaviors. But although autonomous learning is about taking responsibility for our own learning, that doesn't mean that learning has to be isolated. It can also involve learning with and from other people. So notice the difference here between being alone and being autonomous. So being alone is being without other people, whereas being autonomous is being independent and having the power to make your own decisions. So learner autonomy is not necessarily about learning alone. And while some learners do, of course, engage independently in individual activities and tasks that allow them to practice and reflect on their learning, authentic and meaningful interaction with other people is really important for helping learners to construct new skills and knowledge. And we're going to have a look a bit later at ways that we can help learners access this kind of interaction, even in remote learning contexts when they're not in a face-to-face classroom. So learner autonomy is about taking responsibility for our own learning, but how does that work in practice? What does that actually involve? We're going to have a look at 3 stages involved in autonomous learning. And these are forethought and planning, so looking ahead, monitoring and control, and reflection and evaluation, so looking back. And this is adapted from a framework of self-regulated or autonomous learning, which was developed in 2002 by the educational psychologist Paul Pintrick. And it's important to view these stages as part of a dynamic and ongoing process. So it doesn't finish with reflection and evaluation, but reflection and evaluation feed into further forethought and planning. So forethought and planning is about looking ahead. It's about learners asking themselves, what will I do and how will I do it? Monitoring and control is about understanding what's happening in the moment. It's about learners being conscious of how they're learning and asking themselves, what am I doing? How am I doing it? How can I improve what I'm doing? And importantly, do I need help? And reflection and evaluation is about looking back. It's about learners asking themselves, what did I learn and how did I learn it? And how can I do better next time? So notice that these questions are very much about students being conscious and aware of what they're doing and how they're doing it. So this is about self-regulation, and some of you mentioned self-regulation in the chat box earlier. And as we've seen, this is the ability to understand and manage one's own behaviors, but it also involves metacognition. Metacognition is knowledge and understanding of your own thinking. So thinking about thinking, if you like. So it's not just thinking about the subject that you're learning, but it's also stepping outside of yourself to have a critical awareness of how you're learning that subject and what your thought processes involve while you're doing so. And we're going to have a look at some practical approaches to supporting learners in each of these areas when teaching in digital and online contexts. But first of all, how does learner autonomy benefit students and teachers? Let's start with students. How does learner autonomy benefit students? What do you think? What are your observations? Type your answers into the chat box. What are the benefits for students? Okay, so people are saying increased motivation, students being able to learn at their own pace, at their own speed, promoting confidence, preparing learners to be lifelong learners. I like that. Students are often more attentive, allows students to learn independently or by themselves. Learning is more meaningful, helps students to develop critical thinking skills. They can be proud of their achievements, absolutely. So it's quite rewarding for students. Promotes participation, so engages students when they're taking more responsibility. Giving students more confidence to express themselves. Some great answers coming in here. Thank you for your contributions. So studies show that interventions that promote self-regulation and metacognition have a positive effect on students' use of effective learning strategies, on their motivation levels, as you've observed, and on their academic performance. So learner autonomy is believed to play a crucial role in a person's academic and personal success. And studies have consistently reported a strong correlation between the use of metacognitive and self-regulatory strategies and L2 learners' language proficiency. So there's a lot of evidence that being more autonomous, self-regulating, and being conscious of what you're doing and how you're doing it leads to better learning outcomes. And of course, this is what we want for our students. So we've seen how learner autonomy benefits students, but what about teachers? How does learner autonomy benefit teachers? What do you think? Type your answers into the chat box. Saving time, okay, that's really important. Yes, and that's something we're going to come back to. Lessens the workload for a teacher, more teaching time. Engages students, which of course is not only a benefit for students, but it's also a benefit for teachers too when your students are more engaged. Helps to manage big classes. Responsibility is shared, absolutely. Improves the relationship, so building relationships are very important in the classroom context to make students more comfortable. And again, we've got motivation. So motivation benefits the students, but it benefits the teachers too. So it's quite hard to separate these ideas of the benefits for students and the benefits for teachers. Of course, there's a lot of overlap there. Helps us to manage our time better and include more activities. Okay, thank you. So the benefits for teachers. When students are more autonomous, they learn more about themselves. And this enables us as teachers to learn more about our students. And when we know more about our students, we can offer them better guidance, and we can plan and we can prepare subsequent lessons more appropriately, so we can teach more effectively. And lessons are more enjoyable for the teachers. So we've seen that promoting self-regulation and metacognition in the classroom results in students being more motivated. And as some of you have pointed out, when learners are more motivated and more engaged, the lessons are more enjoyable for the teacher. And when students are more autonomous, learning is less teacher-centered and more learner-directed. So this means that in synchronous classes, which run in real time, teachers can spend more lesson time exploring and introducing new ideas. And in asynchronous classes, when learners are studying in their own time, teachers can spend more time offering guidance to help students get the most from their out-of-class experience. So that time saving that several of you pointed out is really important, because what do we do with that time? We use it to help our students more effectively. Okay, we're going to focus now on developing learner autonomy in digital and online learning contexts. And as we know from the past couple of years, remote learning requires students to be more autonomous than they might in a traditional classroom. In the physical absence of the teacher in digital learning contexts, learners might need to set their own learning goals and work towards them. They might need to motivate and encourage themselves throughout the learning process, and they might need to evaluate their own progress. So how can we help students to do this? Well, we need to make sure that students have the tools they need to work independently. So one thing we can do that's really valuable is to introduce students to different online learning aids and digital tools, things that will help and support their learning. And we need to train students in how to use these and encourage them to reflect on their experience. So what online learning aids and digital tools are you already familiar with? Of course, many teachers have been more exposed to digital tools in the last couple of years than previously, but are there any tools or learning aids that you already use in your teaching? What are your experiences? Okay, so Jeff is saying write and improve. Dave is saying video recording, Padlet, Quizlet, Google Slides, quizzes. So we've got lots of ideas coming in here. So learning aids and digital tools. An example of a digital tool might be a mind mapping tool, such as Miro, which learners can use in lots of different ways. We'll have a look at this in a few minutes. And an example of a learning aid might be an online dictionary, for example. So you can see the Cambridge Dictionary on the slide here. Okay, we've got lots more answers coming in. Jamboard, Google Classroom, Classroom Dojo, quizzes, Wordwall, Microsoft, great. So we're going to have a look at some different practical approaches and digital tools to help support learners in developing autonomy in digital learning contexts. And some of them you may be familiar with, some of them you may not. We'll give you a link later on to some resources where you can find out more. And remember that we've identified 3 stages involved in autonomous learning. So we have forethought and planning, monitoring and control, and reflection and evaluation. So let's start with forethought and planning. So as we've seen, this is about learners asking themselves, what will I do and how will I do it? And we can break this down into more detailed questions, such as, what's my goal? What steps will I take in order to get there? And what resources will I need? So in a digital or remote learning context, you might start by encouraging learners to think about, discuss, and decide how they will approach tasks, activities, and projects. So it's not just telling learners what to do, but inviting them to plan for themselves and to think through what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. And next, you can invite learners to use a digital whiteboard or a mind mapping tool, such as Miro or Google Jamboard, as some of you have mentioned, to organize their plan for what they're going to do. So this could be a plan for a specific lesson, for a task or a goal, or for learning more broadly. And you'll see on the right-hand side of the screen here, there are some examples of templates from Miro. And tools like Miro offer a lot of flexibility for how students can use them. So as a teacher, you could select a template for your students, or you could have them research and select their own. And finally, encourage learners to share their ideas in a collaborative digital portfolio, such as Padlet or Bulb. And this collaborative sharing aspect is really important. So remember that although some learners might be in contexts that require them to practice and reflect on their learning independently, authentic and meaningful interaction is still very important. And this interaction doesn't only take place in a traditional classroom setting, but it can also happen online or remotely. And this is a nice way to start familiarizing learners with mind mapping tools and collaborative portfolios. And of course, these tools can be used in lots of different ways to help students consolidate and organize what they're learning. Once you've introduced learners to these tools, and they're familiar with how to use them, then they can start to use them more independently. Let's have a look at monitoring control. We're going to do an activity together now, so you'll need a pen and paper. And I'd like you to draw a circle on your paper, make it nice and big so you've got space to write. And I'd like you to divide your circle into 4 segments, like the example on the screen here. And draw a little sketch of yourself in the middle of the circle. Doesn't have to be a great work of art, just a stick man if that's what you're comfortable with. So nice big circle on your paper with space to make some notes. Give you a moment just to do that. And I'd like you to think about what you're learning in this session. So this session is about developing learner autonomy in digital learning contexts. And I'd like you to think about this question. What are you doing? So think of this as quite a general question. If someone came into the room now and asked you what you're doing, what would you say? What are you doing? And make some notes in the first box, the segment in the top right-hand corner between midnight and 3 o'clock, if you like. What are you doing? For this first question, I'm going to help you out with an example. So you might write something like, I'm watching a webinar, or you might say, I'm finding out what learner autonomy actually is, or I'm learning about ways to develop learner autonomy in digital learning contexts. So Sevin just said here, I'm listening to you. That's great. Your second question, how are you doing it? So make some notes in the second box about how you're doing it. Are you listening? Are you watching? Are you making notes? Are you making notes on screen or on paper? Are you drawing your notes? Are you writing full sentences or just keywords? Are you thinking about how the content applies to your own teaching context, to your own students? So you've identified what you're doing, but how are you actually doing it? And some of you are a little bit ahead of me because your next task is to type your answers into the chat box. We've got some answers coming in here. So taking notes, writing full sentences, watching, noting keywords, screen grabs, Antoinette, great. Listening and recording. So we've got full sentences or just a few words, taking notes, thinking about how to apply this. That's great. I like that one. Paying attention. Good. I'm very glad to hear that. Okay. And your third question. How's it going? How's it going? Make some notes in the third box about how it's going. What's your experience like? Are you finding it easy? Are you finding it challenging? Maybe it's thought-provoking or inspiring. How are you feeling? How are you feeling about what you're learning? And why might you be feeling like that? So we've got enjoyable. I feel like a student. That's lovely. It's lovely to feel like a student. Excited, interesting, challenged. That's good. So why might you be feeling challenged? Learning new concepts. Struggling but learning. That's interesting, Gillian. So what is it that you think is making you struggle? We're going to come to the next question with that. The final question in the top left corner is, how can you improve the way that you're doing it? So perhaps your notes could be grouped into things to try and things to think about, things to find out more about, things to look into. Maybe you have distractions at home and you might learn better without those distractions. Maybe you wish you had different color pens. So how can you improve the way you're doing it? So we've got researching new concepts, that's nice. So execution, so trying out ideas in your classroom, practicing. Trying new tools, reflecting about the process, that's really nice. So what's especially nice about this activity is it enables learners to monitor and control the way they're learning by thinking consciously about the strategies they're using or that they could use while they're working. Now, I asked you to do this activity on paper, but of course, learners can use a digital whiteboard or a mind mapping tool such as Miro or Google Jamboard to make their framework and to think about the questions. And of course, they can share their ideas in a collaborative digital portfolio such as Padlet or Bulb to compare their answers and support each other with observations and suggestions. And again, once learners are familiar with this activity, then they can use it independently to monitor different aspects of their learning. So you could apply this to different activity types, such as reading or writing tasks or language practice activities, or you could use it in the middle of a lesson, just before the break, for example. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and participating in the last task. And now let's have a think about reflection and evaluation. So I'd like you to imagine that your learners have just completed a task, a lesson, or a project. What questions could you ask your learners to help them reflect on and evaluate their learning experience? So type your ideas into the chat box. What questions could you ask your students to help them reflect and evaluate their learning experience? What would you like to change in this task next time? Great question. What did you learn? How did you do that? How did you learn? Oh, share an example of a decision that you made during the task. That's brilliant. I'm going to add that to my list. How do you feel about this task? What did you find challenging? What worked well? What did you like most? We've got some brilliant answers coming in here. Did you enjoy the task? How difficult did you find it? Did you feel like you were improving? What would you change next time? You've got some great questions. This is what I love about these sessions, is we have teachers all over the world coming together and sharing ideas. And here you are in your own context, working independently, autonomously, and yet collaborating and sharing with other people. So I'm going to share with you some of my ideas here. Thank you for your contributions. So here are some examples of useful questions that you could ask learners to help them reflect on and evaluate their learning. I'll just give you a minute to read through these. So you'll see some similarities here between your own ideas, thinking along the same lines. And some more questions here. Here's another set for you. Have a look at these. And of course, in digital and remote learning contexts, having learners reflect on the different online learning aids and digital tools that they've used really helps them to identify which are most valuable for them as individuals for supporting their learning going forward. So reflecting on the tools they're using as well as their thinking processes. So we've had a look at some useful questions for reflection. You've contributed some fantastic suggestions. Now let's look at the process of learners actually engaging with these questions. So you might start by choosing some of those questions and giving your learners a set of questions to discuss, for example, in breakout rooms, if you're teaching synchronously in an online classroom. So you could have them discuss these together. And next, you could invite learners to record a video of their answers using their phone, and they could upload it to a video sharing platform such as Flipgrid. Don't know if any of you have heard of Flipgrid, but it's a fantastic website and application that allows teachers to facilitate video discussions. So you can organize your students into groups, give them an access code, and they can engage in discussion and conversation by recording short videos of themselves asking and answering questions. And finally, encourage learners to watch each other's videos and give feedback and comments by recording a video reply or a response. So students are working independently and autonomously, but they're still taking part in meaningful interactions, even if those interactions aren't face-to-face. So we've looked today at these three dynamic stages of autonomous learning and how we can support the development of learner autonomy in digital and online contexts by encouraging learners to engage in activities that help them to plan and organize their learning, that help them monitor and control the strategies and the approaches they use, and to help them reflect on and evaluate their own learning. And remember, these stages should be viewed as an ongoing process. So reflection and evaluation inform students' future planning and so on. And we've looked at how we can integrate the use of a few different digital tools to support students' learning. These are the ones that I mentioned here. But of course, as you've pointed out, there are so many online learning aids and digital tools out there. We've only had a look at a small handful, but you can find out lots more on the Cambridge World of Better Learning blog by filtering the topic to technology and digital. So we have a link there for you in the chat box, and that will take you to our World of Better Learning blog with lots more ideas for different digital tools that you can use. And once you've taught learners how to use a particular tool in class and they've reflected on what they find valuable and useful, they can then make choices about what to use to support their learning independently going forward. But as well as using online learning aids and digital tools to support students in becoming more autonomous, we also need to think about course materials and how can we choose the right materials to help students work independently and take more responsibility for their learning. So before we finish, I'm just going to give you some tips about what to look out for when you're choosing materials. So the materials we choose need to provide clear guidance, instructions, and tips that support students through their independent learning. And this will help them to plan and to monitor their learning. And regular feedback is important for helping students monitor and control their learning, as well as reflecting on their learning. And we need digital materials that include progress tracking to help students independently evaluate their learning. And this will help them not only to reflect, but also to determine their next goals and continue to plan their learning going forward. So when you're choosing course materials to use in digital learning contexts, look out for these features, because as well as helping learners become more autonomous, when materials have these features built into them, this can really reduce the workload for you as a teacher. Okay, finally, last question for you for the moment. What one idea, resource, or activity will you take away from today's session? So a little bit of reflection for you as well. Type your answers into the chat box. One idea, one resource, or one activity that you'll take away. So Sandra's saying Jamboard, great. If you haven't tried Jamboard, try it, it's fantastic. New applications, remember there's lots more on the World of Better Learning blog as well. The circle exercise, great. Yeah, I love working with frameworks, because a framework like that can inspire you to actually put some content in there. It's much easier than just writing on a blank page. If you give your students a framework, it's a lot more motivating. Flipgrid, new apps, the circle exercise, reflective circle, great. Okay, thank you very much. So to find out more about learner autonomy and digital learning, we're putting some links in the chat box for you now. So if you want to know more about learner autonomy, if you're looking to deliver learning through an online course, or you want to know more about digital learning in general, have a look at those links there in the chat box for more insights, tips, and activities. And thank you very much for your participation today. It's been great to see so many of you here and so many of you sharing your thoughts and ideas. So I'm going to bring Simon back in now. Hi, Simon.
Hi there. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, if you want to add a question into the Q&A box, then please do. That would be really good. Just a couple of questions in there at the moment. So yeah, thanks a lot, Jade. Just wanted to say that we also have a colleague of mine, Jasmine Silver, who is our Senior Language Research Manager. So she's going to be around and able to answer any of your questions as well. So that's good. If Jasmine, I don't know if you want to say a quick hi.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you can see me, but I am here.
Great. Thanks very much.
All right.
I can see you.
Great.
So let me just I'm just looking at a question I've got here, which is, I think, a sort of fundamental question to what we've just watched, which is, could you tell us if there's any easy ways for learners to become more autonomous? Any tips or anything you can suggest, perhaps?
Jasmine, do you want to start with that question?
Yeah, sure. So we've got a nice set of resources as part of the Cambridge Life Competencies framework. So many of you will have heard of this already, but if you haven't, this is a great resource that's all available for free online. And there is a key competency in there called Learning to Learn, which is really helpful for looking at learner autonomy. So we have a booklet which talks about what is involved with learning to learn, covering many of the topics that Jade has mentioned today. So how do students take control of their own learning? How can they plan? How can they evaluate their own learning? And that includes some classroom tips as well. So that's worth looking at. But also we have some activity cards for learning to learn, which is something that you can just pick up really and take without really doing any preparation at all. They're just quick little activities that you can add on to a class as you see fit. So hopefully we'll be able to post those links into the chat.
I think I've seen, yeah.
Yep, they're in there already. Brilliant.
A question related to this, it says, are these courses free? But they're not courses, are they?
Yes, so the Cambridge Life Competencies framework is not a course itself. We do use the framework in our courses. So you'll see lots of activities in course books that use the Cambridge Life Competencies framework already. But the framework itself is just a resource for teachers as well as our publishing teams. So that's completely free. There's no charge for that.
Great.
Just to add to that as well, so the activity cards that Jasmine talked about for the Life Competencies framework, the Learning to Learn ones, all of those activity cards have a little addition for if you're teaching online. So if you're teaching in digital and remote learning contexts, how you can tweak those activities. And what's brilliant about them is they don't require much planning or forethought. You can use them with any materials, and they help your students to become more autonomous, to think about, to engage in metacognition and think about how they're learning. So they're really great. I really recommend checking those out if you have a chance.
Thanks very much. Another question here. I mean, we could see that there's so many resources out there. There's so many things to do online, to use in your classes. And, you know, the students will probably know a lot more than you as well. So there's so many things out there. One question here to sum this up is, what is the digital resource that you like to use most of all in your practice in online teaching contexts? So any favorites?
Yeah, I think probably one of my favorites is Padlet. And what I love about Padlet is that students have just one space where they can share, they can comment, they can like, they can respond to each other's content. And I think for me, that's really important. I think teaching online And I noticed there's a question here about teaching one-to-one as well, and we'll come back to that. But teaching online, just because learners are somewhere maybe at home on their own, doesn't mean that they can't collaborate. And I think that collaboration is really important. So my favorite kinds of tools are tools that encourage that kind of collaboration, and digital portfolios like Padlet are one of those. So I think that's probably my top favorite. It's the one I use most often, certainly.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, a question here from Diva, I think, just checking, I think she's just checking. She's read a theory from Benson, 2011. He stated that there are 4 stages of learner autonomy from metacognitive side: planning, monitoring, evaluating, and problem solving. Are they the same theory that you've just discussed? Is this the same thing?
There's overlap there, yeah, definitely. So of course we talked about forethought and planning, we talked about monitoring, and we talked about reflection and evaluation, and problem solving can thread through all of those different aspects, because problem solving is quite a key part of learning to learn, because you're evaluating what you're doing, how you're doing it, and looking at how you can do it better. So it's kind of inherent in all of those from my perspective.
Thank you. Just scrolling through, don't think there's any other questions coming through in the Q&A box. Lots of nice comments and a nice green heart there for you, Jade, in the chat box. So I've got another question here. I mean, if we don't have any further questions, that's fine. We can wrap up. But you talked about key features to look for when choosing materials. And I'm not sure if you're aware of anything you'd recommend for materials that reflect those things. I think it was guidance, reflection, and tracking, I think, that you talked about before. I don't know if you have anything to comment on that, or because I mean, I'm thinking about there's a new Evolve Digital course, which as the name suggests, it's an online course that Cambridge have, and I think it definitely ticks all those boxes. I mean, it obviously allows the independent study, but there's the synchronous teacher-led classes as well with the notes. So it's just obviously a Cambridge product, but just something that I thought about immediately. So this is Evolve Digital, which I think there's 3 levels out now. The first sort of level A1, A2, and I think B1 are out at the moment.
Yeah, I've only seen one of those levels actually, but one thing that struck me about Evolve Digital was they have these lovely little tips boxes for students about how to do the tasks. So they're really kind of helping with the guidance there, because quite often in a digital context, you can be given an instruction and there's nobody there to explain it to you. So having those little tip boxes are great. They're fantastic in those materials. So yeah, I agree with you. I think Evolve Digital is great. And it does give regular feedback and progress tracking as well.
Yeah. Did you say you go back to that question from Audrey? Is it different for one-to-one teaching?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, actually, Audrey. Thank you for asking that. Of course, one of the issues with one-to-one teaching is that it's much more difficult to create those collaborative environments. But you do, of course, have that with the teacher. In terms of developing autonomy, I don't think it's different in so much as your forethought and planning, your monitoring and control, reflection and evaluation. I think all of those things still come into one-to-one teaching. And in some ways, as in many other ways with one-to-one teaching, you have a lot more quality time with your student to be able to think about and talk about those things, and to be able to encourage that metacognition and self-regulation that makes learners more autonomous.
Thanks. Another question here from Nada. Interesting one. Do you think that digital learning enhances a number of the students' skills but makes them lazy in others? So doing stuff online, is it really just focusing in on only certain skills and we're missing out on others?
I think Nada's got great questions. I think that's a really good question. And I think that some digital tools do risk making students lazy in some ways, but I think that's where these kind of activities that we've looked at today and these kind of reflective questions are really important. Because it's not just using an app and doing something and then ticking that box. You need to be able to talk about how was that app useful? What were you actually doing? What was good about it? What was bad about it? How would you change it? How is it impacted your learning. And I think these whole approaches to learning autonomy, this reflection, is so important in digital contexts.
Yeah, it gives a good framework, I guess, to work to, which is something I've not really thought about before. Just looking to see if there are any further questions, and if there aren't, we can maybe wrap up here. Okay, there's one here, sorry, from Paulina, just seen there in the chat box. Do you think there might be some negative aspects of reflection and metacognition? When could they go wrong or be inefficient?
That's a really interesting question, isn't it? Yeah, so from my perspective, I'd say, I mean, there is a problem, I guess, if students are not as self-aware as you would like them to be. So they could potentially get too negative in their reflection, just thinking about what's gone wrong, or on the other side, they could have just thought, well, that was brilliant, what I did there. So I think it does need some teacher guidance in the beginning, and a bit of monitoring to see that students are having the right kind of balance when it comes to reflecting. I don't know what you think about that, Jade.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I think, you know, your role as a teacher in helping students to develop autonomy is not so that, you know, they can do everything without anybody, but to actually help them understand how that can be valuable for them. Because if all they're doing is identifying things that went wrong or things that were difficult, then of course there's going to be a negative impact on that emotionally, and that can really hinder learning. But if you can support your students in identifying how to prevent things from going wrong in future, or how to identify other approaches that are more valuable for them personally, then that's brilliant. So yeah, it does require teacher support. I agree.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of a shift, hasn't there, to online, and a lot has been asked of teachers over the last couple of years. So, you know, we hope everyone's coping with it and everyone's all right out there, and people have now introduced a system that they're more comfortable with. Because I know doing webinars a couple of years ago, it was people were just not prepared for it, and they really needed help. So let's hope that this webinar will do that. I think that's all I can see. So I think we'll wrap up there.